Well, good morning, everyone. As my screen kind of flashes around on us a little bit here today, and we'll get all back to normal. It's always good to have a little bit of live show business to see the world doing various strange things. I'm Jim Satterfield. Welcome to our webinar today with the Eastern Great Lakes Contingency Association, and we're certainly glad to share some thoughts with you. We're looking at what happened this year and some of the impacts that were out there, and discussing questions might be for all the organizations that are listening. This is part of the 2017 Crisis Coach webinar series to do with the Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Professionals and the Rochester Chamber. So we're glad that you're here today. So let's talk about being our friend. We are active on social media. You'll see multiple ways to reach out and talk to us, and not the least of which there's a hashtag for today's session, and that's hashtag Crisis Coach. We have attorneys just like everybody else, so we've got lots of disclaimers that you have to hear the oral commentary for it to be complete, and plans should be read in conjunction with your local authorities as well as legal counsel. And we're not giving legal advice today. I have a hard enough time just giving advice in general, but especially legal advice. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. We empower you to manage crisis and risk. Firestorm expertise is in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach, and so we're balancing that tension between crisis and risk and following a predict, plan, perform methodology. We're very fortunate today to have Jay Williams with us. He's the president-elect for the Association of Contingency Planners, Eastern Great Lakes Association. By the way, Jay, are we still using planners? I thought we were professionals now.
It is professionals.
Okay, we'll get that changed on the next slide. Sorry about that. Jay, what would you like to say to everyone who's attending today?
Just good morning. We're so thankful for the partnership, and we're looking forward to the value that this partnership creates for us, for the people that we have the privilege of supporting and working with. And as we come into this end of year review, it's exciting always in this profession to look at lessons learned, to look at how we can do things better. So just thankful for the opportunity.
And I would encourage you, if you're in the Western New York area, to attend the meetings that are there. It's a chance to network with your peers. It also gives you resources. If you have questions, you can get them answered. And it's certainly a great opportunity. And every year they have a major conference in September, and you might want to look at that as a real training opportunity within your organization. By the way, you can watch past webinars at firestorm.com, and you can register for future ones at that same site. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm the president and CEO of Firestorm and co-founder, and I'm glad to be speaking with you again today. Every now and then they let me come on the webinar, so I'm excited to be here as we speak. So if we start to look at this year, we see a great many things that have happened during the year, and we're going to review that today and go through an infographic that you can download afterwards to talk with your people and organizations to help focus on it. And December is certainly a time of reflection when we think about all the events that have happened, and we really want to focus on what have we learned and what should we be looking for. So let's go and look right now at the year in review, and you should now see hashtag A Year in Crisis 2017. And this will be an ongoing program we'll be doing each year to let you look at what's happened and then think about your plans, think about your organizations and your facilities to see what's in place. We started off early in 2017 with violence, and we're going to look first at some violent events, and then we'll look at other categories as we have our conversation today. And it started off with a shooting at the airport down in the Fort Lauderdale, the Hollywood International Airport, and that was in the baggage claim area. And if you look at that, and I think one of the reasons why that resonates with all of us, because obviously any shooting and death is a particular event, but with all the travel that most of us have to do for our jobs, being out in those areas and exposed. If you, along the left-hand column, you'll always be seeing other information and some recaps of stories. Along the right-hand column, as we scroll down, you'll start to see some statistics and information that I think you might find interesting. And Firestorm does surveys. So the Firestorm survey program and research starts to give us actual numbers to put with this. And one of the surveys that we did was around the ability to respond effectively in an active shooter situation. And it's interesting, of all the respondents, half felt that they were not ready for that, and they were very concerned about that response. So as we think about violent events, it's unfortunately around us in every area. Not every violent event is an active shooter, and if you'll see in the center of your screen the United Airlines story. Certainly affected brand and reputation associated with that. We have the doctor being dragged down the aisle by security, in fact, even being mugged on the plane. There were comments from the president of United Airlines that said, oh, we didn't do anything wrong. And those comments ultimately cost him the opportunity to move up and become the chairman of the board within that organization. So when you look at in any crisis, the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say make a real difference. And so being prepared to deal with those things makes a difference. Another one of the research areas was people in your organization would never do anything unethical. This was a question we asked because we've been dealing with corporate culture, and when you think about the hashtag #MeToo and the types of allegations that are there in the market, and I was staggered by this, that over 72% were either unsure or felt that their people might be doing those things in organizations. That sends a very strong message to all of us as we think about our plans and our programs in dealing with those types of events. So having a culture of preparedness makes a difference in covering a great many of those things. There are certain trends that we've been looking at. You see a variety of hashtags that we're looking at in the left-hand column. But violence can come anywhere. Here we have the story from April that you may have missed out of St. Louis, where a utility worker, a gas worker, was killed. You go to work every day. You don't expect that your life is going to be disrupted, and particularly out. But think about the position that many times home service workers find themselves in. If you were going out to cut off the electricity or the gas or the phone to someone for non-payment, what their reactions might be associated with it. We worked not last year, but the year before with home health aid because there was an armed intrusion into the home that she was serving and helping at that point in time. So those types of events can certainly create tension and involvement. We also look over in the left-hand side that sometimes good news happens. The sheriff's office responded and was able to prevent a mass shooting at an Orlando school. By the way, yesterday there was a report just here in Georgia about another county school where a similar event happened, and they were able to thwart it before it occurred. That's why predict, plan, perform becomes so very, very critical to all of us in thinking about looking at what's going on around us, looking at behaviors of concern to identify those before violence happens, before the gun comes to work or comes to school. So that's a program that you'll be hearing more about, obviously, in 2018. We're rolling it out both in schools and businesses. Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment, the acronym is BRTHA. And if that's not part of your program, when you think about workplace violence prevention, it should certainly become a part. Now, that area is referenced over in the right with that survey, and you'll notice that 40% of the companies don't have formal programs to identify these behaviors before they escalate to violence. And that's one that you should be considering and thinking about as you're doing your planning. And we'll give you some insights into what's going to be happening in January at the end of our discussion today to think about learning some of those areas. But violence could occur anywhere. And we remember in May the shooting at the concert in the bombing at the concert in London. And one of the things we talked about a lot during this year was that violence that we were seeing in the UK and in Europe was, from a terrorism standpoint, would ultimately be coming to the US. And unfortunately, that prediction became true in 2017. And after we finish going through this infograph, we'll talk about the bombing in New York City. We had the car attack, which will be referenced a little further down in New York City. Terrorism now is an increasing concern in the minds of employees in all organizations, and it's something to be thinking about. I'm sure everyone who went to the concert in the UK didn't go there with the idea of what's going on around me. And talking about the concept of situational awareness, who's next to you? Where, if you had to evacuate the area you're in, which direction would you go? What's the right strategy? We'll talk about the Vegas shooting in a few minutes, but some of the people just laid down on the ground and thought that that might save them. Actually being stationary increased their potential for being a target. So thinking about these things makes a significant difference. The shooting over in the right-hand column talks about 5 employees, and 5 employees were shot in a company of 34 people. Think about that. And that's by a former employee who came back to work, and it was a predictable one, again, around those behaviors of concern. So as we think about it, it looks like violence is not an unusual occurrence in America. It's a where we are today to be better understood. Many times when I'm out and speaking with groups or meeting with folks, I ask the question, do you feel violence in America is staying the same, decreasing, or increasing? And unanimously, I'm hearing that the feeling is that it's increasing. If you're feeling that way, your employees are feeling that way, and so it should become a part of who your organization is and what you're doing. Now, we have the hospital shooting in the left-hand column. By the way, healthcare workers are one of the highest risk categories of workers. When you think about a hospital has to be open, you also think about when there's a negative outcome in a medical event, then someone related to them could come back and look to right a wrong or a perceived wrong associated with it. The doctor in the one on the left came back. Now the statistics are you're much more likely to have workplace violence from an existing employee than you are from a total stranger. So we see existing and former employees becoming factors for us to consider. Now, the ride malfunction at the Ohio State Fair was not an attack. It was a failure of the equipment and had a death as a result of that. The civil unrest in Charlottesville around Confederate statues and their removal. In America today, we don't speak with each other, we speak at each other. And I think that area of rising tension and violence is certainly not one that's going to go away. The right-hand column again was talking about another survey we did about how concerned are you. And it's interesting, if you look at the 39 and the 50, 89% of the people in that Firestorm survey indicated that they had concerns over workplace violence. Doesn't have to be a shooting. It could be bullying. It could be the hashtag #MeToo with inappropriate contact or pressure. No one should be afraid to go to work every day. No student should be afraid to go to school every day. And this growing level of violence is one that seems to be almost an epidemic. And we talk about communicable illness, but if we talk about where we are from a violent standpoint in America today, it's certainly a concern that we would need to look at. We had the shootings in a restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina. The chef was shot. So think about the times when you go to dinner and you're sitting there and an event could be occurring in that area. There is no off limits. There's no safety base associated with it. And then the big story with the shootings in Las Vegas. Here are people at a concert hearing and then seeing the shooting happen. And look at the number of dead, the number of injured. It's the largest mass fatality event from a violence perspective in America. As a result of that, we've seen a significant shift in the hospitality sector with hotels and venues looking at what are their plans, how are they going to handle it. And I would encourage you, when you're going to one of these, to remain situationally aware. Look at where you would go, where you would move, and what would you need to do. Think about your organization. You're on the phone today, and you may be a business continuity professional where you're working around those, keeping the organization functioning, or IT disaster recovery. But physical security needs to be integrated with all plans and have programs in place. Then we had the attack on the bike trail in New York City, which was a mirror of the events that occurred in the UK and continue to occur. So being aware of where you are, automobiles, trucks, those things can be used as weapons. And the most recent pipe bombing in New York City was certainly a call where an individual felt that they should respond. I think we do a lot of training and work in all of our organizations over emergency response and emergency plans. But if you look at this survey that was done on the right, the Firestorm survey, 57% of the people were either unsure or felt they weren't confident in their ability to respond into an emergency. We were doing an exercise this week with a financial institution and looked at their ability to make decisions and move people and handle in a variety of areas. And so that's an opportunity for you to think about. By the way, the left-hand column references a book, Disaster Ready People for a Disaster Ready America, and it's about having a plan at home. You can download that book at no cost off the Firestorm website, or you can even have it printed for your company with your logo on it, about having a plan at home, because family trumps job, and having a plan at home is a fundamental element of it. As we were winding down the violence events for the year, and boy, I hope that sentence is true, that we've wound down the violence events for the rest of this year, we had the shooting at church, the one in Texas in November. 26 people killed, 20 wounded in this area. We see churches being targeted and are working with one of the insurance carriers in the space to make sure that plans can be put into place in those directions. What are the plans at your church or your mosque or your synagogue? Looking at them and the ability to do it, you've got an open environment where you want people to come in, but again, those targets. So one of the lessons learned here through 2017 is violence isn't decreasing. It's either holding or increasing. Our perception and our coverage is that it's increasing, and violence is more than the active shooter. We had a lot of active shooters listed in this review, but think of that hashtag, Me Too. So you can connect with us on LinkedIn and a variety of other ways. Nonviolent crises, and we had a full year of those types of events. You'll see in the left-hand column where Apple dismissed an engineer because his daughter posted pictures of the iPhone 10. By the way, I always thought it was funny when that was initially coming out, and the use of Roman numerals was lost on many people. It was the iPhone X in looking at it. But when we think about cyber breach, when we think about intellectual property, there's many ways that that can be shared and broached, and those types of things can happen. And what are the policies within your organization? By the way, what are the information assets that you're trying to protect and looking in those areas? Inappropriate content shared by a Visitors Bureau employee certainly probably is not going to increase tourism in those areas. Data breach at a printing company, and that was legal information. Imagine the law firm sending out confidential information and having it broached at that. Cyber is generally one of the largest risk concerns that we're finding at the board level in organizations that we're meeting with. Primary concern, because it's one of the few things that can absolutely destroy your brand and reputation in a single event. And look at the level of concern to support that. In the Firestorm survey to the right, 92% were either somewhat concerned or very concerned about data being breached. And it is a defining event for organizations. We've certainly seen that with a variety of areas. And the San Francisco, there was a power outage that caused a significant disruption for an extended period. If we lose power, we go back 150 years in time. I think probably all of us have had a power outage and gone into another room and flipped the light switch, and again, we're surprised that the lights wouldn't in fact come back on. Think about your organization, and as business continuity professional, what will happen if we lose power? What's our strategy? How are we going to communicate, and how are we going to operate? Looking at who's responsible in a crisis, and leadership will certainly be held accountable in each of those areas. And confirming that is that information to the left that 80% of the people felt that they couldn't contain those communications. We'll talk about crisis communications in just a few minutes, but looking at these types of events, the phishing attack on Gmail users coming out and the exposure associated with it, and your largest single exposure, I believe, from a cyber area is the human element. The term we use is picnic, problem in chair, not in computer. And if you're looking at employees responding to phishing attempts where they click on something they shouldn't, and that then allows the malware or the keystroke logger or the criminals to have access directly into the business. The survey on the right shows that 48% of the companies are actually training their employees now around it. So if you're not, that's certainly something you need to consider and to put into your plans for 2017. Now, over in the left-hand column, you'll see that area where it talks about cybersecurity. That's another infographic we've done earlier this year, particularly on cybersecurity. You can again go to the Firestorm website and download that. And it's a good tool to talk with your people. The Equifax breach was gigantic. And you can see again who's held accountable, that question we ask up above. The CEO, the CFO, the CTO, and the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO, all lost their jobs as a result of those areas. So there's a lot to look at and think about. There's additional, this cyber breach crisis coach, we did an exercise around that, and it's a chance for you to learn more about the brief associated with it. By the way, in 2017, Firestorm was purchased by Novum. Novum is a company specializing in professional services geared toward helping anyone that's a government contractor, but really large businesses. And it gives us an expansion of the depth of services that we can bring to you. Moving out of this nonviolent ones, we have natural disasters. Certainly it was a horrific year, more so than we've seen in the past several. We started with August with a tornado hitting in Tulsa, and more than 120 businesses were impacted, at least 25 were injured. Look at the Stella storm producing 5 feet of snow and fitting into those areas. We also did another survey about a major crisis or disaster. Could your organization assure the health and well-being of those combined if you in fact had to shelter in place for an extended period? 50% were unsure. When we talk about the hurricanes, which we will in a few minutes, and look at the devastation in Puerto Rico, what if that had happened in your area? How would you have handled it? It might not have been a hurricane, clearly, as we're talking about Western New York and the exposures there, but there could be plenty of issues that could, in fact, require you to remain in place. That winter storm dumped a late snowstorm in March of this year. We had a storm here in Georgia, in the Atlanta area this past weekend. We had 6 inches of snow, canceled 1,100 flights on one day. I was out in LA working with a client there, and my flight was canceled. And so it certainly had a real impact with it. We also had the earthquake in Mexico this year. It was a 7.1, 250 deaths. And interestingly, we saw effects of this with clients and their employees in California. Because of their relationships back with family members in Mexico, it became a real concern. And so thinking about the impacts of events, even if they're not occurring at your location, on your employees, are certainly a lesson that we learned there. The hurricane season ran from June 1 to November 30th. We had 3 Category 4 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, that came through. Puerto Rico is still feeling the effects of that, and I'm seeing some reports that there are as many as 1,000 people who died as a result of that, and much of the critical infrastructure is not yet back in place. We had the wildfires that impacted us in Northern California, and now we're having the wildfires around the LA area, and the devastation is unbelievable when you look at those areas. By the way, we added a new EVP and Chief Operating Officer at Firestorm this year. His name is Hart Brown. He also has expertise in the insurance sector and in working in the cyber field. So if you need some help, there's certainly additional reading materials that you can gather off our website. Again, all of those are available at no cost. You can join us on Facebook and other types of areas. This is another brief on the right. This is an infographic around communicating in a crisis, and I'll talk about some of the elements. Again, these materials are available for you at no cost by downloading off our website. So I would encourage you to think about this year and what it means for next year, and follow that predict, plan, perform methodology. Understand what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what their impacts. How are you going to monitor them? What are the triggers that cause activation of your plans? What types of plans and policies do you need to have in place? And as we saw, many people feel that their organizations are not fully prepared, and then finally perform. So let's go back to our PowerPoint today, and hopefully we will. And I'll get down to the right slide. And there we go. We'll go back. So the bombing that occurred this week in New York City shows how vulnerable we are. Metal detectors aren't on public transportation. The ability to access and be an open society is something that's extremely important. But the ability of the lone wolf, the one person, to be able to come in is certainly something to be considered. One of the advantages that we have in any of the violence areas are the statistics. 80% of the time, if someone has intent, someone else knows. And 67% of the time, 2 or more people know. And when people know, what do? They talk. And where do they talk today? They talk on social media. If you don't have a predictive intelligence program in your organization to monitor social media, to see what's going on around you and within your organization, that's a vulnerability that you can easily fix in 2018. So take a look at these events, and then secondarily, the concept that we talked about just a few minutes ago, being situationally aware of what goes on around you, becomes absolutely critical. When we think about communications, there are 3 types of communications in a crisis. The first communication is coordination. What do you want your people to do? Do we shelter in place? Do we evacuate? Do we lock out? Do we lock down? What's the update? Are we going to be open tomorrow? Are we not going to be open tomorrow? That's an area to be building into your plans and having those messages pre-written, because it's easier to edit than it is to create. Many of you have notification systems, making sure you have multiple ways to get that information out. The second type of communications that we think of is the crisis, the brand and reputation communications. And you've heard us talk a great deal over the course of the year that everything you hear initially is wrong. So those communications can be delayed at least 24 hours. When someone comes to you in your organization and states, well, we need to get out in front of this and frame the issue, you have the luxury of time here to be able to hold that communications back. But again, crafting the messages When we talked about doing a vulnerability threat analysis for your organization and you're planning those out of here are the things that could happen and here are the impacts and here are the triggers that would activate our plans, go one more step and say, what would our messages be if that occurred? What would we be saying? Craft them now and do message maps, and they're easier to edit at the time of the crisis. The last type of communications would be compliance. Many of us are regulated, and you're regulated even in certain parts of your business. For example, if you had a cyber breach, you'd have to notify anyone whose personally identifiable information was stolen. So you need to look at and think about those communications also. Now, when you're talking about communications themes, home basis, where do you start? What are you going to say? Much better than saying no comment is at least having general statements that you can share. We will not be defined by this event. What does define your organization? Who are you and where you're going? We'll invent the future. What changes are you making to make sure that your organization is secure? And then finally, that we're going to reach out to the people that were impacted. We're going to embrace the families. Those were the messages that we used at Virginia Tech at the shootings now over 10 years ago, but it serves as a firm foundation. Going back to the shootings in Vegas, look at the quote from the mayor. This has been a resilient community who has not been defined by this sick, who will not be defined by this sick, disgusting human being. It certainly is a significantly better comment in talking about who you are and where you're going and where you're going to be placing them. Now, one of the things that happens to all of us is we know what we know, that goals portion over to the right. And in many cases, we know what we don't know. So that's what all our planning is around. How do we handle ourselves in those situations? Planning for what we know about, knowing, hey, we can't be sure that won't happen, so let's have a plan. But if you'll notice, the biggest exposure you have is what you don't know, you don't know. The rate of change and the way that information is coming and things that are happening certainly is a big exposure. I would encourage you to continue to think about what's happened in a similar area that could happen to you in another industry group or segment, or something that's happening outside of the U.S. that could suddenly be coming here. Those are things for you to be having within your plan. There are 5 common failures in a disaster or crisis, and they're shown here. Failure to control your supply chain, failure to train your workers for home and in work, failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. By the way, the threats and risks, we're doing a much better job across the country in identifying them. We're doing a very poor job of monitoring for the threats that we've already identified. 4th is failure to exercise and update our plans. If your plans haven't been updated in 3 years, you're not following standards and best practices. Portions of them need to be updated on a quarterly or an annual basis, for example, your contact information. And last, the failure to develop a crisis communications plan. What are you going to say in each of those areas? So if you think about those 5 risks and that you face, starting to plan now, the likelihood that they're going to come in. By the way, even when we talk about things like data breach or cyber breach, we're seeing many of those coming in via your supply chain and accessing. Now, across any crisis, looking at how your team performs relative to others is very important. This is the maturity model, and I would encourage you to use this if you do an exercise within your organization about how we're going to handle this crisis or event. In a crisis, we focus on the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and the communications effectiveness. And you see 4 stages of maturity that you can be in. So you would look and see, where was our organization in this exercise or in this crisis event? And obviously the goal is to move from the left to the right. But if you were 3s and 4s in every area but 1, and you were scored down as a stage 1 liability, your response would be limited by that. You would, in essence, go to the lowest rating sector dimension that would be at that point. So if you had confused messages, highly reactive, key channels missed, and messages not timely, your response would not be good in that crisis area. By the way, every time you move from one stage to the other, you get a breakthrough within your organization. Moving from a stage 1 to a stage 2 is a control breakthrough. You're now much more in control. If you can get to a stage 3, you're now aligning your organization to be prepared. But the goal is to get to strategic, and that's where the value comes into your organization, and it makes a great difference in being a part. So we talked about now is the time to act, to predict, to understand those vulnerabilities and threats, to develop the plans, and then to perform the training and the exercises. That's how you're going to go about building a comprehensive program. Now, the infographic that we went through today is available on the Firestorm website. You can go to firestorm.com/2017 year in review, and you can download that. I believe it will serve as a good tool to start a conversation within your team and your organization and with your senior leadership. This is what's happened in America this year. What do we need to be thinking about for next year, and what do we need to do? Now, there's also an opportunity today to participate in an event impact management report. This is a service that's being done by BC Management, and you can participate in that survey by going to their website and logging in and giving your information. And the beauty of it is you'll get a copy of the full report. BC Management does 6 of these analysis researches each year on a variety of topics, and it's a source for you to have the ability to, how does my organization match another, the ability to benchmark against it, and I would encourage you to look at that. We're also going to do a webinar in January, helping make the most of your organization in 2018, and focusing on now's the time to plan and prepare. You can sign up for that. That'll be in January and coming. And again, there is no charge for that. But we're going to be focused on solutions, and there's some new tools that we can make available to you to have you think about those abilities to respond. So we covered a lot of ground in our conversation this morning. 2017 was a memorable year. We certainly saw a great many things happen, and the exposures that are there. And if we're wanting proof why you have to have the programs in place that you have within your organization, this year certainly underscored it. Our thanks go out to the Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Professionals. Any comments back that you want to add to our discussion today?
I would only say that on your slide for coordination and compliance to, if you're not already doing this, involve legal in the coordination phase, because too often they become involved in crisis communications, and to your point earlier, that's a little bit later than it could have been. So involve them in the coordination phase.
Great insight and examples of why I'm meeting with the group and sharing with your peers what you're doing. Bringing legal to the table, and in many cases as you're responding, and if you're bringing in outside professionals, having them to come in and work under the legal counsel in contemplation of litigation gives you the potential for attorney-client privilege in those events. So identifying them in advance, having them ready, having pre-established messages that legal is comfortable with, then the focus on the decisions could be moved to what changes do we need to make, and when do we release the message, instead of what is it that we're going to say, keeping you in control. I thank you for joining us today and hearing about what happened this year. It was a full year. Our hope is that 2018 won't have quite as many opportunities. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a realistic expectation at this time. From what we're seeing, we're coming into the winter storm area, and that's always appropriate to think about when I think about, in particular, Western New York and the lake effect snows that come in and the impact that they're going to have. Certainly that'll be an immediate dominating factor for all of us as we think about those. But as we move through the year, there'll be other exposures. There will be, unfortunately, more violence occurring this year across America. What is your plan if it's in your community? What's your plan if it's at your company or organization? Do your people know what to do? Do they know how to do it? Do they know when to do it? Those are all topics that I would encourage you to begin those discussions now. We'll give you some solutions next month, and we'll talk about that in particular. But I think violence needs to be an increasing portion of your business continuity program and thought process based upon what the reality of what we're seeing in America today. If you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com and send us a note. You've also have a tremendous amount of intellectual property that you can download there at no cost to help your organization in planning. If you've got a specific question, drop us an email at webinars@firestorm.com and we'll get back to you quickly. We will try to reach out to everyone on today's webinar to see if there are questions that we can answer. Or if you find yourself in a crisis, pick up the phone and call us at 800-321-2219. We man that phone 24/7. We have a crisis stop program that we help organizations with, and that first hour of crisis support can become extremely critical. It's the decisions you make, it's the actions you take, and the words that you say that will determine is this going to stabilize or escalate, and particularly in that critical first hour. That initial consultation is done at no cost to you or your organization. I hope you don't need us. We hope we don't have to get on the phone and talk about that, but right now, 6 times a day, someone's calling us that is in a crisis. We're here, we're ready to help. And thank you for all you're doing for your organization and your employees and fellow workers to make sure that they're safe and that your company can continue to prosper and survive as we look at 2018. Have a great and wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. We'll talk to you in January. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.